And good morning, Ospreys, and good morning, everybody. This is John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff_2020. And this morning, by special arrangement, we have an extra edition of Harley and Me, I guess I can call it. Harley Schlanger, the great journalist with LaRouche PAC, is joining us for an hour of conversation, which I'm calling Election Correction and Special. Good morning. Sorry about that. Election Correction. And, well, Harley, let me get you connected here via Skype, and we'll get together and see what we can come up with to fix this crazy universe, or at least maybe this country. And good morning, Harley Schlanger. How are you?
Good morning, John. Nice to be back with you.
Oh, it's such a pleasure, and I see you brought all your books with you this time, or at least quite a few.
A lot of them.
We usually see you with your smaller set with on your blog at larouchepac.com, which I'm addicted to, by the way, and so much so I'll just let you know I produced a little 8-minute segment. Your second half this morning was just so outstanding, if I may say so, that I wanted everybody to have a chance to look at that in preparation for this morning, because, wow, you put it all together in under one little 8-minute roof, and I congratulations on that, and I'm going to share it as much as I can.
Well, thank you. I mean, the thing I found is the mathematician Pascal once said, "Forgive me for the length of this letter, but I lacked the time to keep it short." And I realized that to do a 10 or 12 minute daily update with so much happening, it's very, very difficult. And in the ebb and flow of everyday activity, I usually don't have enough time to really compact it. But the last couple of days, I've been staying up extra late at night to make sure I can have a more tight briefing. So I'm glad you appreciate it. I think it's a way for me to see that the work is worth it.
Well, yeah, we're hoping that it's all going to pay off by January 20th. Well, you put it very bluntly this morning, and maybe we could just start with a summary of what you were saying as in terms of Lyndon LaRouche's adage, "Know your enemy."
Well, what I was partly addressing is the disinformation that's coming out, because this is a moment where, look, there's very little time to do something that's extremely complex, which is to put together the two tracks of the vote fraud. Now, Giuliani's been under attack, but he's doing something which is almost impossible, which is how can you take what Sidney Powell calls the old-fashioned ballot stuffing and show that it all adds up to prove that you would have won the election had it not been for this. That's Giuliani's track. And so what he's done is he's had to go in and find out how many dead people voted, how many people voted who didn't live at the address they were registered, how many signatures didn't match, all these sorts of things. And then he added to that witnesses who were poll watchers who saw irregularities at the polls, but also poll watchers who were not allowed to watch. And so he had to put together a picture to show that there was an extremely large numbers of irregularities. Now, the media says there's no fraud, no evidence of fraud, it's baseless. They should look at what Giuliani presented. It may not be the complete picture, but it shows there was fraud. And then the question that you have to come up with, if you can't prove it's enough to overturn the election, what do you do? That's where Sidney Powell is now coming in with second track, cyber fraud, where the election machines rigged so that some votes that were supposed to be for Trump went to Biden, or they disappeared, or just there were votes added to Biden. Whenever there was a vote for Biden, he got the equivalent of 2 or 3 votes. And then also, were they entering into the computers fraudulent votes from Giuliani's track? So to do this is an enormous undertaking. But I think if you look at Sidney Powell's lawsuits, and if you look at the appendices she has some technical experts who are attesting to the fact that they found what's called a backdoor into the Dominion voting system machines, which means you can add things from behind without anybody noticing it. Also, that it was at one point some of these machines were connected to the internet, where they're supposed to be closed systems. So if they were open, there would be a record in the computer that that happened. So then the question is, can the machines be audited? And in many states, the election officials are saying, no, we're not going to allow it. And so they've had to go to court to allow the machines to be open. So while all of this is going on, the president has said he's not going to concede. He's still fighting for the vote. And this is what he should do. I mean, he's doing what any legitimate figure, leader of a nation should do, which is to say we're going to make sure all the legitimate votes were counted and the illegitimate votes were not counted. Now, that's where things stand right now. There are legal cases in the 6 battleground states. Most of them are getting tossed because, to tell you the truth, I think the judges are not really reading what's being presented to them. If a technical expert says he could go in and in 7 minutes with a screwdriver hack the voting machine, shouldn't a judge hear that in court before he says there's no evidence of fraud? But they're not. They're throwing them out. So there's a second path that the Trump attorneys are taking, which is they're going to the state legislators, because under the Constitution, it's up to the state legislatures to certify which group of electors gets to cast their ballots on December 14th. And so there were hearings in Michigan just yesterday, hearings in Pennsylvania and Gettysburg on the 25th of November, hearings in Arizona. And now there's some things moving in the court. One of the things that happened in Arizona, for example, on the first track, is that they took a sample of 100 write-in ballots and had them hand test the signatures. And they ended up, and also the results on the ballots, and they ended up finding 3 that should have been for Trump, or 2 that should have been for Trump that were counted for Biden, and 1 that was counted for Biden that shouldn't have been, another one that shouldn't have been for Biden. So 3 out of 100. That's 3%. The margin between Trump and Biden in Arizona was 0.5%. So if you find a 3% margin of error on a sampling of 100, you should look at more, and that's what they got the court to agree to. In Nevada, they got an order to look into the machine. In other states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, they're not getting that. So what they're doing now is you have bills in the legislature that are saying that they will not certify the Biden electors until there's a full investigation. So that's the first part of the fraud fight. And I think there's all kinds of smoke and mirrors being put up by the media and by the opponents to Trump. But if you look at what I just presented, it's a classic case that there must be a more thorough investigation. Now, what did Bill Barr say, the Attorney General? Well, we looked at it, we looked at the case and found no evidence of enough fraud that would overturn the election. And then Giuliani came back and said, you didn't interview one of the witnesses. We have 400 or 500 people who signed affidavits swearing before the court that they're telling the truth, that they saw something irregular, something that was fraudulent. Barr didn't interview any of them. Neither did Barr look at any of the machines, or the DOJ look at any of the machines. So now Bill Barr, after Giuliani shot back at him, Barr said, okay, well, we're still looking. But this is the kind of fight it is. So, I think that's one thing. Now, John, the other thing I covered today in my update is the disinformation that's out there, including coming in on the Trump side. Now, on the Biden side, the disinformation is no fraud. Trump's a sore loser. We beat him. He should just slink away and let us take over. But the other part of that is there's disinformation being put out by the Trump side, which is not coming from Donald Trump, but it's coming through some of his attorneys, through people like General McInerney and others, who were usefully bringing up initially the whole question of cyber fraud. But who do they attribute it to? China, North Korea, and Iran. Now, they're missing the elephant in the room, which Sidney Powell correctly identified in her original press conference. The British, Lord Mark Malloch Brown, a member of the Privy Council, who's on the board of Smartmatic. Malik Brown is on record bragging that his first case of vote fraud was in the Philippines in 1986, the so-called Yellow Revolution of Cory Aquino, in which he worked with the CIA to bring down Ferdinand Marcos and put in Aquino using Smartmatic software. And in 2001, he bragged about that to the Manila Daily Paper. He's also connected to George Soros. Now, here's where I bring up the question for people of why do you think China did this? China is a target of regime change funded by people like Soros, as is Russia. Who's the third big target of regime change funded by Soros? Donald Trump. It's Soros and Malik Brown and British GCHQ, the Five Eyes intelligence, which includes New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the UK, and the US. It's the Brennan, Clapper, Comey crowd in the United States, the Peter Strzok's, this guy Chris Krebs, who came from Microsoft to head up the Department of Homeland Security voter security operation, who said there was no fraud, and then Trump fired him. So you have a group of actors who are not Chinese, who are not on the Chinese payroll. Soros is not Chinese. He's trying to destroy China. Malik Brown is not Chinese. And then this fake story that was put out by Alex Jones yesterday about UBS. It was UBS Security, which is not quite the same as UBS Bank, but it was a company that was tied up with Chinese companies in terms of finance that made a loan to Dominion. But that's not the government of China. This was another one of these smokescreens to try and send people in the wrong direction. If you're looking for China hacking, you're not going to find it. Now, here's another point. The Chinese don't really want Biden. And I know about the Hunter Biden laptop and everything about that. I don't know there was Chinese government funds that was involved in that. And I don't really know if it was a couple $1 million that went to Hunter Biden and to Joe. But the Chinese don't like Obama. They don't like Biden because the two of them were part of the so-called Asia Pivot, which was an attempt to begin a surrounding of China to isolate and encircle China. And this is what Esper and Pompeo are doing, but this is not really what Trump wants to do. If Trump has a second term, I can assure you that very soon he's going to go back to the phase 2 of the trade talks, because the U.S. needs China and China needs the United States. But the idea of going after China is to take people off the scent of the Privy Council and the British and their connection to the military-industrial complex in the United States. So I think I took a little more than 8 minutes to summarize it, but that's what I covered in my update today.
Wow. Well, thank you again, and I really do appreciate the idea of let's scrutinize these things that have come out, especially on the Republican side. And George Webb has identified a number of these folks that really, like Steve Bannon, for instance. I think that he is an agent of disinformation, and he is not somebody without a lot of baggage. I've seen him connected actually to was it Louis Freeh somehow, and then back to that crowd. And that opens up the other can of worms. There is
just on Bannon.
Yeah, please go ahead.
He's on the payroll of a Chinese billionaire who is out to destroy China. And he works with a hedge fund operator named Kyle Bass, who has been taking his clients' money and trying to short the yuan for the last 5 years. And he keeps losing them money. But he's insisting that sooner or later the yuan is going to fall and he's going to make a windfall. So Bannon has a thing about China. Now, he claims to be against regime change and against the war machine. The war machine, the military-industrial complex, has now pretty much concluded that it's going to be difficult to get trillion-dollar budgets against Russia. So now they're saying China is out to take over the United States. Now, I can say a lot more about that, but that's Bannon's line. Bannon's trying to track Trump into an anti-China posture. And this is very dangerous, partly because it interferes with the relations that Trump was trying to establish with North Korea, where you notice we haven't heard much from Kim Jong-un recently. Threats, new missiles, anything of the sort. So Bannon is one of these loose cannons. Also, if you look at some of the people Trump got rid of, like General Mattis, General McMaster, these are people who are pushing the China, go to war with China line. Now, Flynn is different. Flynn will sometimes bring up China as a threat, but he's doing it more from the standpoint of what's called the Thucydides trap. What happens when one country is going down and another country is coming up? And in history, especially if you're talking about empires, it usually ends up in a war. And so Flynn is saying, how do you avoid the Thucydides trap with China rising, the U.S. collapsing? The way to do it is to reverse the collapse of the U.S. And that's why Flynn liked Trump so much, because of the commitment to rebuild our industry and science and technology, and to have that back up our military strength, as opposed to having a bunch of bomb-dropping radicals like Tony Blinken, Obama, the people who brought Hillary Clinton, who brought us into one war after another, where we can't win these little wars. How the hell are we going to win a big war without using nuclear weapons? So I think Flynn is different from people like McInerney and some of the other just typical anti-China people. The other thing about Flynn is he wants to dismantle the intelligence community. And the other point I made in my briefing this morning is that people who are now on the China, China, China line ought to think back 6 months and realize that the Russia, Russia, Russia line, which we now know definitively was a bunch of lies, that was being pushed by the same people who are now pushing the China threat. So, I think most Americans can figure it out, but some of them just get trapped in the simplistic, the Chinese hate us, they're trying to take us over, let's go after China. Now, that's why it's important for people to take a step back and look at these things through history, the way you've been trying to do, John, to get a sense that our so-called intelligence community is not ours. It's not protecting us. It's not defending the national security of the American people, but it's a private operation. It's a government operation, but it's protecting private interests tied to the City of London and Wall Street, the ones that Perkins identified in the economic hitmen, the International Monetary Fund, the central banks. That's the threat to the country. And if you go racing around looking for Chinese footprints on vote fraud, you're not going to find it. But you're going to miss the fact that there's an enemy that's been our enemy since our founding, which is still trying to use us to protect their global empire. That's why we've got to get focused on the British.
Wow. Well, thank you again. And every time that I say the British, I find that I have a number of correspondents that want to make sure that I understand that the British people are with us, and they are. And absolutely, we love our cousins in Great Britain, and in particular, I think it's important that we single out the idea that this is a war, but it's not a war of red versus blue. It's not a war of Trump versus Biden. This is a war of the elite tiny percent that controls the purse strings of the world economy against every other human being on this planet. And that has got to be the way to open this thing up, so that my dear brothers and sisters on the left that just can't understand, where's John gone, what's he talking about, that they will come back and we can talk and we can show how much we all desire the same thing, which is a reasonable life, peace in the world, and the restoration of American values as defined in our elementary schools, for goodness sakes. So that's the war that we're in, and it's a war on many fronts. And thank God we're not talking about violence, but in terms of every other means that we have to throw it all at them right now. So
Well,
that's
and much of that war, John, is out of sight. When you talk about a shadow government, what's the shadow? They're doing it in the dark. And now with the new, very powerful cyber technologies, you don't even see the people doing it. It's being done in micro dots and microseconds. And not too many people understand this, the way this is functioning. But intelligence warfare has been the chosen battleground for the British ever since they figured out they couldn't defeat us on the physical battleground. And that's been in the 20th century. The idea of recruiting a section of the American establishment to British values. That's why the Royal Institute of International Affairs was instrumental in setting up the Council on Foreign Relations at the time of World War I. That's why the British were so interested in helping FDR set up his wartime intelligence. But there's a really fascinating story. I brought this up a couple of weeks ago on one of our events. If you go back into the late 30s, the files of American intelligence, you find some of the best people who were, we didn't really have an intelligence community then, but people who were working in the State Department and at the time the Department of War, were looking at something that was defined by a French term, synarchy. And what does synarchy mean? The files in these State Departments say synarchy, Nazi, communist. And what they identified is how the elite were using on the ground left and right wing, basically thug operations to destabilize governments. And that while these thugs were out there fighting it out, the establishment was working together. This includes, for example, the syndicates during World War II, where the Rockefellers had deals with German firms, the rubber companies, the oil companies, the petroleum companies, the shipping companies, all had interrelated relationships. This is like today's corporate cartels. They don't recognize a national interest. They have a supranational interest. And that's what the British have crafted as the way of fighting the war. And so for the last 30 years, the poor Americans have been down here with NAFTA, with the free trade agreements, with the World Trade Organization, with all these supranational agencies making policy. And all we see is that we're losing ground. We're losing our industry. We're losing our standard of living. Our education system has gone to hell. And we say, why? Well, the Chinese didn't do it. We did it to ourselves under the influence of this intelligence warfare. And that's why it's important to realize that so many of these Americans who are involved in it are Rhodes Scholars. They study at Oxford. They're interchangeable between the Chatham House, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, the Atlantic Council. They all meet together, the Davos crowd, the Davos billionaires. They have international powwows where they decide what the policies will be. And then the idiots in the Congress sit there and rubber stamp it.
Well, maybe they're idiots in terms of not paying attention to what's their rubber stamping, but they're pretty smart in terms of putting money in their own pockets.
Yeah, the new motto in the U.S. is if you want to get rich, join the Congress.
Absolutely.
But if you trace the money, what you find is that it's these cartels that fund the think tanks that shape the narratives, including in the media. And there are left and right. You have the Heritage Foundation, you have the von Hayek crowd, the neoliberals, but now the Democratic left is neoliberal. But I want to you said something very interesting about what about our leftist brethren, the progressives. What an insult to Bernie Sanders that Biden's bringing in Neera Tanden to the Office of Management and the Budget. She's one of the people who is most vociferous against Bernie. She's even more nasty towards Bernie than she is to Trump. Not coincidentally, because she's one of the leading neocons, neoliberals. Shouldn't be anywhere near a Biden cabinet. but that tells you who put Biden in there. You look at Blinken, Tony Blinken. You look at Janet Yellen. Everyone says, oh, what a wonderful choice. She's so experienced. Yeah, she's experienced at creating funny money. Great experience as the former head of the Fed. She's experienced at trying to figure out scams for new bubbles, like the green carbon bubble that she's going to do as a Treasury Secretary, working with the other central banks. So when you really look at what's underneath it, it is a coup. And it's a coup that's not just a retreaded Obama administration. It's like an Obama administration on steroids, where Biden may be the place setter, but he's not making the policy. And it's coming from these think tanks and these corporate councils that exist up above the established government and choose who's going to serve. And it also now includes big tech, as we see quite clearly.
Harley, that reminds me of, well, there's so many comments I want to make. Let's start with Biden for a second. It's been my observation that during the election season, our electorate has been targeted as to which echo chamber they're belonging to, if you're in the red chamber or the blue chamber. And people in the blue chamber seem to have gotten a pretty intelligent walk and talk Biden that seemed to be acceptable, if not exactly their dream candidate. Whereas people in the red chamber only see the bumbling Biden, the Biden that can't put a sentence together, that forgets his wife's name, he forgets where he is, he doesn't know how many states are in the union. He is a complete buffoon. So, I put it to you, these media manipulators could be setting us up for an actual division of the country, in the sense that you have a Biden who is completely unacceptable to half the country. And then you have a Trump who is completely unacceptable to a different half of the country. Now, I see three ways this can go right now. Number one, it's settled in the courts. That means that Pennsylvania comes up with a solution. Arizona, Wisconsin, all the states, they eventually have a solution which is approved by the Supreme Court when challenged, and whatever they've done, that's it. That person wins. The other solution, the other question is, will these people behind the scenes, our deep state, our extended British Empire agents, will they be acting to make sure that Biden wins no matter what? Mm-hmm. Or option three, will they just simply put all their energy into completely dividing us to the point where we completely collapse as a united country?
Well, I think there's an element of all of those that they're playing with. I mean, the last two that you mentioned, if Trump is a victor in these court cases or these challenges of the Electoral College, you have Antifa, you have Black Lives Matter, you have the whole East Coast, West Coast, so-called intelligentsia whipping up a civil war. And that's a real danger. And it's very possible that since the British, if you think about it from the standpoint of the Anglo-American intelligence elite, what do they want? They want the American people to shut up and just do what they're told. And they want the military power of the United States to be deployable to collect the debts worldwide, not just from the former colonial countries, the poorer countries, but now increasingly looting the citizens of the United States and Western Europe. We see it in France. Macron just tried to push through new security laws this week that would have essentially put people in jail for up to 5 years if they take a picture of a policeman committing a brutal act on a demonstrator. Doing away with any semblance of freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. He had to back off it because of the reaction from the population. But they're moving toward these draconian policies, whether it's a lockdown, whether it's silencing the whistleblowers, where they have, as you said, one choice is to strengthen the United States under Biden to do the kind of escalation of regime change wars and debt collection that they need. Or, if they don't think they can control the United States, pull the plug and let it disintegrate. So those are two options that are unacceptable. Now, the third option is the American people are going to have to act through their more local elected officials, the state legislatures. Under the Constitution, the legislatures have the final say as to who is seated as electors. And that's why these hearings are so important. The citizens are now being brought onto the stage of history. And in most of these battleground states, or a number of them, the Republicans are the dominant party. Now, if they decertify Biden electors based on evidence of fraud, the Democrats are going to say, this is not evidence, this is fake, it shouldn't be allowed. And they'll probably challenge it, and it probably will go to the court. That would be a better solution to have that go to the Supreme Court after the legislators act than to have it go preemptively to the Supreme Court, so that the Supreme Court would be acting over and above state governments. And I think we saw in Bush, Gore, and Florida that they waited until the process was pretty much finished out in Florida before they acted. So if that's the precedent, then it's going to be up to Americans in these battleground states to mobilize their legislators to act to defend the legitimacy of the vote. Now, Trump can play a role in this. I don't think I brought this up yet here. I've done so many interviews today, I can't remember. There are three things I advocated Trump could do to move this process ahead. The first one is that he can finally release the documents that are classified and unredact them and force them out into the public so people can see who's been involved in the 4 years of anti-Trump regime change coup activity, to make it absolutely clear that this was an illegal, corrupt gang of criminals who are running this against Trump. The documents are there. They're being sat on by Gina Haspel, that's CIA, by Christopher Wray, by Pompeo, and others. Trump has to find a way to force them out, and it looks like Bill Barr won't do it, so Trump's got to do that. Secondly, and he's said he's thinking about this, appoint a special counsel or a special prosecutor who can investigate vote fraud, not leave it to the Department of Justice, but bring someone else in who can treat it as a criminal matter. And point number three, pardon Edward Snowden and Julian Assange. Bring them back. Now, they don't have anything specific on the election. They can talk about what's been done to our country since 9/11 to establish a surveillance state with enormous power vested in the hands of the big tech companies that can do vote fraud, that can control the media narrative, that can run cyber warfare against other countries. It can run drone warfare against other countries. And Julian Assange is in prison for what? For exposing war crimes committed by American military units and intelligence units. And on this, the question is not so much the prosecution of the soldiers, but why is it that Bush and Cheney lied us into an Iraq war, which has been a catastrophe for mankind, and paid no price for it? What about Obama with Libya? What about Obama with Syria? What about Obama and Biden with Ukraine? Pushing the envelope toward a confrontation with the Russians based on lies. Now, if Snowden and Assange were able to talk about what they actually know, Snowden in terms of the NSA and the encryption and the cyber warfare, and Assange on Russiagate, but also the crimes that were committed, the country would be changed. And under those circumstances, I think a lot of the honest leftists who used to be suspicious of the CIA and the FBI, who used to remember when J. Edgar Hoover was the one who was torturing African Americans and targeting the civil rights movement and running the Red Scares, if they remember that, maybe they'll see again that the FBI and the CIA are not their allies, and that war is not shouldn't be their policy. So I think we could actually create more than half the country that would be in favor of this kind of truth, moment of truth. And following that, you could then have a reconciliation. And if you then follow it up with good economic policies that take the power away from the central bankers, put it under a Treasury Department which issues credit to revitalize the American economy, you'd have a majority by far supporting those policies. So we can get out from under the danger of civil war or collapse, but it's going to require a full exposure of the criminal gang that's been running things, going back to, as you know, at least the Kennedy assassination. And this is what tipped off Eisenhower when he was making the warnings about a military-industrial complex. We've got to have that story told truthfully, honestly, and documented once and for all.
Well, that's I couldn't agree more, and that's what I'm trying to do the best I can with my book readings. JFK, the book by Fletcher Prouty, seems to me to be the first place I would advise people to start looking if you want to look back at the facts behind the Kennedy assassination. And the only conclusion I can draw is that that was a coup d'etat, and that the governments that we've had since then have been color of law, have been, it looks like President Carter is the president, but, you know, this is this is not the republic that was created in the Constitution. I think if we face that, then we can go back and say, now let's fix it, because we do have a Congress. We do have the structure of a federal government that can completely clean out the swamp. As you say, it takes now the American people to rise up on their local levels and to the state legislatures and to the governors of their states and start holding them responsible for free and fair elections, and not just sit back and think, well, you know, rah, rah, my side won. Rah, rah, you know, or boo-hoo, we're stuck with the other guy for 4 years. And that's the end of your political commitment.
And John, not to just react, but to actually think. You know, if you study this history, what LaRouche said many, many years ago, when we were just setting up Executive Intelligence Review as a private intelligence service, he said the starting point of intelligence is you have to know your enemy. And your enemy is not necessarily the one who's shooting at you or the one you don't like. And he said, if you look at the British Empire through its history, they have a long pattern of supporting two sides in a war and using that to manipulate public opinion, so that while you're looking this way, they're moving in the other direction. And, you know, from the research I've done over the years on such things as the Great Game, the development of geopolitics as a strategy, virtually everyone we have in the intelligence community came through the school. You mentioned Carter. It's the Brzezinski, Albright tradition on the one side, and the Kissinger, Alexander Haig on the other side. And Haig's not a very good example because he was not that bright. But it was the realpolitik or the geopolitics. And the geopolitics tended to dominate because that was what the British wanted. And the British can bring into this their role with NATO. And even though they're technically out of the European Union, that's what the European Union was set up to do, to be a manipulation of American policy. And the British also had factions in the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution. And you mentioned Kennedy. Kennedy didn't just one day wake up and say, hey, we're being manipulated. He came out of World War II very studiously looking into this question of colonialism. And whether he got it from his father or more likely from Franklin Roosevelt, from his admiration for Roosevelt, John Kennedy was committed to decolonization. You know, before there was the book, The Economic Hitmen, that's what Kennedy was talking about as a senator in the mid-1950s, looking at what was happening to Ghana, to the Congo, to Nigeria. And he spoke about it often from the floor of the Congress. And from that standpoint, the British looked at him as a threat. And then when he connected it to the private financial control that the Federal Reserve had over the economic system, that's when Kennedy became an existential threat to the British. When he issued that executive order in June 1963 to establish treasury notes, it said that Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, remarked to his staff, "We've lost our Jack." Not over Russia, but over breaking the power of the central banks to control the monetary and financial and economic system. So I think if people study these things, if they become thoughtful as opposed to just reactive, that's why I bring this question up on China. I know I'm going to make a lot of people either angry at me or just dismiss me because I say it's not China. Because they're now, oh, it was China, Sidney Powell said so. Well, Sidney Powell is doing yeoman's work. She's having to go through thousands of witnesses and affidavits and state laws. And she's got someone whispering in her ear that it's the Chinese, it's the Chinese. But she did, in the midst of this, something quite brilliant by identifying Mark Malloch Brown at Smartmatic. So she has the scent of the British, and I think she's being diverted in a way that's going to end up discrediting her. So if people are mad at me on China, do your own due diligence, study this thing. Do you think the Chinese want a war with the United States? They don't think they could win a war with the United States. They don't think a war is winnable. Unfortunately, some of the lame brains on our side think a nuclear war, a limited nuclear war, is winnable. And that's the problem that we have, because they're going to be inside the Biden administration.
I sure hope not. Let me just throw you this is my curveball, but I can't claim credit for it because I read a blog this morning from AIM. I think it's called American Intelligence Media or something. It's the Douglas Gabriel publication, I think his name is. Anyway, he cited the speech that Trump made, and although I don't remember this being in it, he suggested that the election itself, the whole election, has been so corrupted that it needs to be set aside. And in this way, I'm thinking, well, that's consistent with the idea that, Trump is so confident that everything's going to be all right, that this Amy Coney Barrett that they got onto the Supreme Court maybe has already been vetted in some way to support the idea, and that instead of having to fight out every single battle in state courts and federal courts and under time pressure, maybe the Supreme Court could be approached with the idea of, hey, let's just start over again. Let's just have another vote. And
that's very interesting, because look what we do every time there's a so-called contested election, like in Belarus. We tell them to have another election. When they say, oh, Putin is cheating, have another election. The one country that takes that seriously is Israel, which is heading toward its fourth election in 2 years. But what you're saying is interesting, because I think we need something unprecedented to settle this. And on the one hand, it would be Trump just going full bore at the intelligence agencies, but maybe having a new election, which is not specified in the Constitution as a remedy. But if you can't untangle everything that's out there, why not?
I think you're getting my drift here, and for Trump to be able to go to the Supreme Court, and this is where I think that it may be the game plan, because you have Bill Barr, who is, again, he's sitting back saying, hey, I haven't seen any fraud, but we're still investigating, okay, but blah blah. He's trying to be the guy on the ivory tower that's going to call it all as he sees it, and don't worry, I think
the other term from sports is he's dribbling out the clock.
Okay, all right. Well, Anyway, I think that him waiting off in the wings is an indication that he would approve that as a solution, so that he and Trump would go to the Supreme Court together and say, this is what we think needs to be done. And if they can get a majority to just set aside the election and say, okay, the new election day is January 10th, and go for it. And then let's all have a one election day on January 10th and seat whoever wins on January 20th and be done with it. I don't know. It sounds crazy and it sounds impossible, but everything else we've been doing for the past 4 years has been crazy and seemed impossible.
Well, I don't think you'd ever get Biden and the Democrats to go with that because they believed the pre-election hype. Remember, part of the fraud was the setup with this thing from Michael Bloomberg's think tank Hawkfish, which came up with this concept of the red mirage, that because of the mail-in voting, Trump will seem to be ahead comfortably on Tuesday, November 3rd, but as the mail-in votes are counted, it will turn around. That was a setup to prepare us for them shutting down the counting at midnight on election eve. So they had a 3 or 4 hour period to reconfigure the algorithms in the machines, because I think they actually believed in the polls that said that Biden was going to win handily. And the turnout for Trump was much larger than they expected. So they had to do a reconfiguration. Now, given that, their view is that we won fair and square, and we're not going to do a reset. So I don't know that that could actually work. But I think if it's done properly to fight this thing out in the weeks before the Congress meets in early January to certify the Electoral College, that we could have a definitive decision, which would be based on activity by state legislatures in the battleground states, the determination whether or not they can show enough fraud. And that's going to mean you're going to have to rely on some of the cyber experts who can go in and, as Bill Binney said, anytime something is done on a computer, it does leave a mark. You can find it. You can't, unless it's fully erased, which they tried to do with the Georgia machines. And after 3 tries, the Trump team got an order that they can't wipe the machines clean. So look at the machines, look at everything. And the idea that we can't do that, we've got to move ahead, is part of the fraud.
I hear you, and my idea is probably not where it's going, but I just don't know what to think when the president seems so confident, but no court seems to be picking up on his side. He gets some little victories that they cheer about, but nothing big seems to be going his way yet. There's something that he knows, that a lot of things that he knows that I just don't know.
Well, one of the reasons you have a Supreme Court is it's a little more cushioned than some of the district courts and the appeals courts. Like, for example, the appeals courts in the Washington, D.C. area, which are basically a rubber stamp for liberal Democrats.
Yep.
And so you never know what happens when something gets to the Supreme Court. But if I were a so-called right-wing conservative who is convinced that Trump will win in the Supreme Court, I would say to you, don't be so convinced. Strange things can happen with people like John Roberts and others. And so, I think the better course is to go through the legislatures, but to do the work to fully expose how corruption has been carried out in this country, including the corruption of how social media manipulates you. And there are studies now, John, coming out which show that the people who devised the whole social media operation did it knowing that they could use the social media to change the neural pathways in how we think. So it's not just that you can be convinced that you need a new bicycle that you don't really need. It's that you can be convinced that if someone doesn't agree with you, they're a conspiracy theorist. You can be convinced of almost anything based on the manipulation which is the old term for it, was brainwashing. So that's why we can use this as a turning point for the country to break out of the groupthink which determines most political debate.
I must just raise one more thing, which you talked a bit about Mike Flynn, and of course he's recently gotten a complete pardon. And Mike Flynn has also been a person who's attracted some negative publicity. His association with the Bijan Rafikian and the Flynn FIG, the Flynn Intelligence Group, is still there. But what I do, I really appreciate your vote of confidence in him as somebody who can come in as a McDuff and clean up the military intelligence complex, because that is what we need done. And I would forgive anybody anything if they will go in there because, I mean, don't you think that it is military intelligence assets that are being used by these people behind the scenes? It's not just kids with computers in a big building. This is military. Do you agree?
Oh, John, that's a very good point. Look, what Flynn did was he set up his own consulting firm. He didn't go into one of the established firms, which are essentially run by hedge funds and banks and think tanks. Compare that with someone like, what's her name? The person they're talking about for Secretary of Defense. It's escaping me now. Anyway, what's her background? She was a lobbyist for the military-industrial complex. She was a partner with Blinken, the Secretary of State designate, in a firm called West Exec Analysts, which worked for the military-industrial complex. So the idea that Flynn set up his own intelligence operation, his consulting firm, maybe there were some unsavory people connected to it. Well, do a due diligence on all the Washington lobbyists and look at how many of them are involved in corruption. It's just that some of them are part of the establishment and accepted. And so that's where you see this real disconnect. I think Flynn is, he's a real deal. He's a military hero. He's someone who was persecuted because he thought we should talk to the Russians. And what did he say to the Russians? He said, don't just react to the Obama sanctions. Wait till we get in there and then let's discuss what to do on these things. That's reasonable. It wasn't reasonable to impose sanctions, as Obama did, over Crimea and Ukraine, because Obama and Biden worked with neo-Nazis to overthrow the elected government there. So in that sense, people are saying Flynn is unsavory, he's tied to terrible networks from Turkey and so on. They overlook all the people they've accepted, like a John and Tony Podesta, who worked with the criminals, the oligarchy in Ukraine. So, it's hypocrisy. I think the thing they fear about Flynn is that as director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, he was absolutely clear on the fact that the operation in Syria was aiding the jihadists. The operation run by the CIA and Obama aided and supported ISIS. I know, I was thinking of Michelle Flournoy, the prospective Secretary of Defense. She's about as corrupt as they come. But no one brings that up from the Democratic side, although now we're beginning to see it come up. So I'm sorry for the diversion there, but Flynn, I think, was Trump's choice to go in and do what John Kennedy wanted to do when he said we have to bust up the CIA.
Wow.
And I wish he would have had the chance to do it instead of being set up by criminal conspirators in the FBI.
It's so amazing that you just said that, because when they passed that administrative order putting the intelligence operatives under the Secretary of Defense, as was the intention of SACSA, which was my father's agency where his career happened in the 60s. And that career started with recommendations from the newly created DIA, of which Mike Flynn was the what do you call the chairman, the director of the
Correct. Yeah.
of the Defense Intelligence Agency, as Trump was obviously trying to accomplish the same thing that Kennedy tried to accomplish by creating SACSA. Tying all that together is just chilling for me, Harley. Thank you for everything that you do, and all the folks at LaRouche PAC. Guys, get over to LaRouche PAC, make sure and investigate all the assets they have there for you, and make a contribution to make sure that they can continue to do that great work.
And if people want to get my access to my blog site, send me an email, and I'll send you the information on how to do that. Due to the existing privacy laws, you have to actually sign up. I can't sign up for you, but I'll send you the link. My email address is harleysch@gmail.com. That's HARLEYSCH@gmail.
Okay, Harley Schlanger, thanks so much again, and we'll be checking back with you, I think, in about 2 weeks, right after the electors in the states cast their votes. It'll be an amazing conversation, as I feel this one has been. Thanks again, and thanks everyone in the chat. Remember to support LaRouchePAC.com, and go over there and just check it out. It's an amazing asset for all of us. Thanks again, Harley. Bye now.
Okay, John. See you soon.